Whatever you think art direction is, you're probably wrong. Unless you keep up with the production side of anime, in that case, you're probably right. Art direction, an aspect of anime that's both misunderstood and overlooked. Many often conflate it with the Western/live action definition of the phrase, which leads to all sorts of confusion. Naturally, to avoid that, let's define what the term means first. The definition of the phrase art direction is very different when it comes to the anime industry. In the anime industry, the term art direction refers exclusively to the backgrounds and nothing else. You like the character artwork? That's the character design/animation, not the art direction. You like the colors? That's the color design, not the art direction. You get the idea. Art direction is a term that is limited to the background art as far as anime is concerned. One more time for the people in the back. Art direction, backgrounds only. Got it? Let's move on. Much of animation discourse on YouTube, including many of my own videos, tends to revolve around foreground animation. The characters, the movement, that stuff. Art direction usually gets no love. At best, some people mention it in passing. As such, I decided to talk about it. Yes, I'll now spend several minutes of my life yapping about backgrounds, and you will spend several minutes of yours listening to me. Make sure to subscribe. So before we explore this topic, let's go over the process by which background art is produced. As many of you know, background art isn't drawn by the animator. At least the final version isn't. Background animation is its own thing. Backgrounds are drawn by background artists, hint is in the name. The first step involves the art director, a credit you might be familiar with. The process of background art production starts when the art director draws sample artboards. What are artboards, you might ask? They are drawings meant to encapsulate the general look of the backgrounds. An art director works with the series director and other concerned parties to shape the overall look and feel of the world itself, and they do so by preparing the aforementioned artboards. You can think of these boards as character designs if the characters in question were backgrounds. Of course, while background art, color and photography are different departments, the teams working in these departments need to work together to create a cohesive final product. The more they interact, the more consistent the end product is. The art director takes into account the visions of these departments, and the other departments in question do the same. The preparation of artboards is one half of the background art production process. The other half involves the actual pen on paper drawing. And it's not just the background artist who's involved with this process. The storyboard artist and the layout animator also have a role to play in this step. Think about it. You can't just draw a background at your own discretion. It needs to match the perspective of the shot, it needs to work with the foreground, etc. etc. The layout of the background is first conceived by the storyboard artist. The storyboard serves as the rough visual backbone for both the foreground and the background visuals. The layout animator then draws a rough version of the background alongside the foreground components and maps out its movement. The background artist then draws the final background based on this layout in a manner in which it matches the foreground animation. Of course, the background artist does so while using the artboards drawn by the art director as reference. And that is how background art is produced. The art director draws the sample artboards, the layout artist draws the rough layout of the background, and the background artist draws the final version based on both of these components. With all that out of the way, we can finally talk about the topic of the video. It took us a while, but we got there eventually. The term background art is self-explanatory. I don't want to waste time explaining what good background art is. Every metric that applies to good art in general also applies to good background art. One aspect I will talk about is detail. Detail is a double-edged sword. Why is that, you might ask? Aren't detailed backgrounds good? That seems like a no-brainer, doesn't it? Well, not necessarily. Overly detailed backgrounds can and often do clash with the foreground components. Jujutsukaisen Season 1 is a textbook example of that. Also, addition of detail and textures onto a background can be a real hit or miss. Some art directors are particularly good at creating busy, complex and chaotic backgrounds. Shinji Kimura, for example. You might be familiar with his work on Dorohedoro, Blood Blockade Battlefront, or the more recent Kaiju 8. His works look busy but in a good way. On the other hand, less detailed mild/minimal looking backgrounds can look amazing. In filmmaking and photography, there's this term called negative space. It refers to a background that's blank for the most part, perhaps a flat wall or a sky with minimal/no clouds, stuff like that. This background also counts as negative space because there's nothing going on. It's just a sofa, myself, and a flat photography screen. It's a screen, by the way, it's not actually a wall. Negative space can direct the audience's attention towards the subject, and it can be pleasing to look at aesthetically speaking. Also, while we're on that topic, let's address the concept of realism. Realistic background art isn't the only kind of good art direction, of course. Art direction can be realistic or it can be stylized, just like foreground animation. The quality doesn't depend on the approach, it depends on the execution, context, and personal preference. I personally prefer realistic backgrounds, by the way, but that's just me. Realism also applies to the layout itself. A background can have realistic proportions or perspectives, or they can be exaggerated or warped. Again, depends on the context and the execution. Moving on, let's explore this subject through a logistical lens. Background art is usually one of the most heavily outsourced aspects of anime production. Most anime, including major titles, tend to outsource this aspect to specialized studios instead of handling it in-house. Many studios don't even have dedicated background art departments. This, of course, isn't ideal. Like I said, the background art department needs to work in close proximity with the other departments to bring about cohesion. Outsourcing leads to a decrease in the communication between various departments, which leads to problems like perspective issues and whatnot. Although, unlike foreground animation, the outsourcing of background art is relatively normalized at this point, so much so that the anime industry is able to offset the negative effects of outsourcing for the most part. The fact that background art doesn't fully fall apart all the time alone is proof of that. When used well, art direction can breathe life into a show, and some directors excel at this usage. Makotoshinkai, for example, his movies are synonymous with breathtaking art direction. In fact, the visual quality of his pre-Your Name works revolved almost entirely around art direction. They didn't have much going on in terms of actual animation. By the way, he himself was the art director and/or a background artist for many of those movies. Background art, of course, is more than bait for those anime aesthetic accounts on Twitter. Pretty looking backgrounds are great, sure, they give the viewer more reasons to look at a shot, but magic happens when they are used with a purpose. Incorporating visual storytelling into a scene via background art is direction 101. Framing characters in certain ways, highlighting certain objects in the background, using the background to represent certain story beats, etc. etc. A director who pays attention to the background art will 10 times out of 10 create a show that's infinitely more engaging. His or her show will feel more alive and lived in, which is of course a good thing. Several major shows over the years have gone above and beyond to create meaningful backgrounds. Whether it's early Attack on Titan creating lifelike cities with carefully planned layouts, or the more recent Frieren which took into account granular details to craft a sensible world. Of course, a lot of the credit for that stuff should go to the director/storyboard artist instead of just the art director. On a more technical note, clever usage of background art can make a scene feel more volumetric. Backgrounds with complex perspectives tend to look more dynamic. Obviously, some backgrounds are intentionally warped to create a change in perspective. Backgrounds with a warp in the middle that conveys a perspective shift when the camera pans from one side to another are particularly common. Besides all that, backgrounds can convey literal depth. If a single piece of background art is divided into layers and each layer is moved at a different speed, a parallax effect can be achieved. This effect makes a scene which is quite literally flat feel three-dimensional and volumetric, thus it helps convey depth. You'd be surprised by the sheer degree of three-dimensionality that can be conveyed through this approach. All you need is careful planning and competent storyboards and art direction. Here's an example. Look at this cut. Where is it from? It's from an Attack on Titan fan animation, directed and storyboarded by me. Here are all the appropriate credits. It's not done yet, by the way. Someday, hopefully. Since I storyboarded this scene, I feel like I can give you guys a grassroots level look at the intent behind the background usage. I was very particular about the speed at which the two layers of the background, that being the wall with the window and the houses visible at a distance, move. The layer closer to the hypothetical camera moves faster. This makes your brain assume that the layer that moves slower is further away, despite the fact that it's a flat scene and there is no literal depth. Both layers are flat, but if this scene was real, there would be a road between the two buildings, meaning the second layer should be further away, and this effect is conveyed by the difference in the panning speed of the two background layers. The sheer number of retakes I asked for just to get this difference in speed across is ridiculous, by the way. I'm so thankful to our DOP for putting up with my nitpicking. Stuff like this adds a lot to a scene. The example I looked at is of course a lot simpler than professional productions, but I feel like it gets the idea across. And that was art direction, an aspect that's fairly overlooked all things considered. Think about it, more often than not, most of what you see in a frame is background art, but despite that, some people aren't even aware of what art direction is. I had an exchange on Twitter recently which made me aware of that fact. As such, this is a topic I wanted to cover. I guess this marks the return of the quotation mark series, that is of course unless the video flops and I change the title. Let me know what other topics I should explore down in the comments. I recorded this video and the last one back to back, so my voice is practically gone, so let's end it. Like the video if you enjoyed, check out this other bit of content on screen, like and subscribe, and until next time.